Hello, I'm Jocalyn Clark, Executive Editor of The Lancet, and I'm delighted to be part of this session at the Gender Summit. And, really wish we were together in person, but so happy that arrangements were made so that we can connect virtually. Um, my presentation is about gender equity initiatives at the Lancet and how they support the global SDGs. And I'm giving this presentation on behalf of many, many colleagues across the team at the Lancet and the broader Lancet group. And I'm really grateful for their involvement and just really honored to be able to speak on their behalf. Um, by way of introduction, I've been at the Lancet for about 4 years. I started my editorial career after I did a PhD in public health sciences at the University of Toronto. I'm originally Canadian, but I've spent most of my editorial career in the UK. And I spent almost 3 years in Bangladesh as executive editor of a large public health research organization. And I've had a very long-standing interest in gender equity, in women's health, in the broader global contexts of health and medicine. And I'm just delighted that I've had this opportunity at the Lancet to work with the team on a variety of gender equity and diversity initiatives, and really pleased to be able to tell you about that. So I thought I would talk today a little bit about the role of journals and editors. I mean, I think I'm uniquely in this session a professional editor, but we really feel that journals and editors have an incredibly important role in advancing a gender lens, um, which is necessary for advancing the SDG agenda. And talk a little bit about the rationale and the platform that we use for our gender equity and diversity initiatives. And I want to sort of tell the story of Lancet Women, which is the shorthand we use for a theme issue that we published last year to advance women in science, medicine, and global health. And that theme issue actually spawned these much greater commitments and activities at the Lancet Group around gender equity and diversity. And so Lancet Women is a very sort of central platform. And because we're now currently living and working within the context of the global pandemic, and a lot of people are asking questions around gender and COVID, I want to give you some data that I have to shed some light on that story. So for us, the burning platform is pretty simple and it's pretty concerning that there is a considerable gender gap, and that gender gap has persisted for many, many years. We aren't seeing the progress that we want to see. And this cuts across a lot of different aspects of um, the areas of health, medicine, science. A gender gap in career advancement, in pay, in the opportunities that are given to men and women for leadership, in the experience of sexual harassment, which is vastly higher for women, in the kind of unfair care and domestic burdens that continue to fall on women even as their professional responsibilities grow, and a really strong evidence base that shows there is gender bias in how the competencies of men versus women are assessed. This is an unjustified gender gap, and it's unacceptable. It challenges the SDG 5, which aims to achieve gender equality for the world and empower all women and girls by 2030. But it also cross-cuts the lack of progress we're seeing in all SDGs, not just the health ones, which we are often very focused on. But this gender gap reflects and it also expresses the lack of progress of all other SDGs. For us, just to provide you a bit of a summary, some of the key moments for us in this area have fallen along two main threads. One is around content. We're medical journals, after all. We're in the business of publishing content. And on the basis of this burning platform of this persistent gender gap that was not improving and for which we needed much more action and accountability in order to generate progress. We at the Lancet back in 2017 decided that we wanted to devote a whole theme issue to these topics. So we called for papers and had a very successful first ever Twitter chat in December of 2017 for research and commentary on these issues to uncover solutions rather than just describe the problem that had been described and had persisted for so long. And in February 2019, we published a double issue, the Lancet Women theme issue, which contained really wonderful pieces of work from all around the world. And I invite you to please go and read some of this work. And the content that we've published since that time, this is all freely available to everyone to access this issue. And we really have continued to sustain that editorial commitment to these issues, including our first editorial in 2020 in January. It seems so long ago, before the pandemic. There was a time when we were talking not about COVID, but about sustainable development more broadly. So that's the first theme content, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in the next few minutes. But then the second theme was, I think, really importantly, self-reflexiveness on the part of the journal and the editors, that we needed to look at our own processes and our own practices insofar as they had an impact on advancing women within these fields, but also in contributing to this gender gap. So we started doing a lot of internal audits of the diversity within our team and within the peer reviewers and authors we were using, and we set new targets. We then, just shortly after the launch of our theme issue, developed a gender and diversity task force, which I co-chair with my colleague Liz Jocalyn, and has 13 or 15 members from across the department, and we are working on internal recommendations for the entire Lancet group. And this also generated, the task force generated these new diversity pledges, which we have adopted and announced in August 2019, almost a year ago. The theme issue generated an enormous response from the press, from colleagues outside of our traditional audiences. And it really did emphasize the importance of gender bias playing a role in inequalities for women within these fields. And one thing that it really, really illuminated is that this sort of old idea that this is a pipeline problem. In other words, that there weren't enough women available who are interested in science or medicine in order to advance in careers, just simply isn't true, that this isn't a pipeline problem. In fact, there are very, very important reasons why the pipeline, in fact, is pushing women out. And that's because across many nations around the world, so here we look on the left-hand side of this graph, that now 50% or more of undergraduates in science and medicine are women. But at each stage of the career trajectory, women are dropping out, such that by the time they reach the most senior levels, many of the deans or directors are vastly, vastly still men. And that isn't because there's a lack of supply. This is terribly concerning because this represents an enormous attrition of talent, of creativity, of productivity, a loss of these women's rights, and a loss of our return on investment, because we do invest so much in girls' education and making medical and scientific careers so attractive. So this is very much for us a great deal of concern. But why journals and what's the problem? Well, journals, of course, in the fields of medicine and science and global health are the key avenue for disseminating research. Journals also influence the policy, the practice, the culture of science. And for those who are academics, journal publication is the chief currency for how you advance and get promoted in your careers. But women are vastly underrepresented as editors, as reviewers, as authors. Also, we know that sex and gender reporting of research is very poor. And yet diversity and inclusion are really key to our values as journals and as editors. They're also absolutely key to our performance. And here on this right-hand side, these problems that were identified about the role of journals within this greater issue of gender inequality is probably being exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. And I want to talk about that in a couple of minutes. I want to just lay this out because it's an important conceptual framework. This shows you how journals exist within an ecosystem that also includes academic institutions and funders. But our contention was that by being one part of this cycle, we were implicated in the whole cycle. And the truth is that even though in academic institutions, women are very poorly represented in the highest levels, which makes them less available to participate in peer review or as authors. The fact that they aren't included enough in journal processes means that they have fewer publications, which leads to less funding and competitiveness for awards, which contributes to their difficulties with advancement and promotion, and therefore, is part of this vicious cycle. This is concerning because actually this is this has the effect of making women's contributions invisible. We know they're there, we know they're talented, and perpetuates inequities. But we were also really clear as a journal that this is not just about us. I mean, we have a lot as a journal to learn and to shift in terms of vastly growing and diversifying our networks. We know that expertise is out there, and we want to better utilize all the networks and processes at our disposal so that we can identify experts, not just across gender, but across geography, ethnic background, career stage, across sector. But we really need the academic, the clinical, and funding environments to also vastly transform and address what is known to be biased systems within their own fields. For us to diversify requires all those other elements within the ecosystem to diversify. But let me talk about very quickly some things that we have done in spite of that in order to encourage the visibility of these issues, to include more attention to these issues. We exercise positive action. So when we commission, we're commissioning from a much broader group of diverse authors. We're also editorializing as editors so that we're saying to our readership that these issues around the gender gap and gender equality are tremendously important to all of our specialist fields. We've really spent a lot of time in the last year thinking mindfully about all aspects. It's not just content, it's how we use images. It's what images we place on our covers. It's who we invite and profile in our podcasts, in our perspectives sections, which do essays and even obituaries. We have to be much, much more mindful that we're making positive choices about reflecting the diversity of our fields, of our readership, and giving credit to women pioneers and women experts who haven't had the visibility that they deserve. We've also published audits from external actors. So I said a couple of minutes ago that we've undertaken our own audits, but also we've been very open to researchers outside who have done their own external audits of our practices. We have published those in the interest of transparency and for all of us to learn. We've also really tremendously refreshed our entire stable of editorial advisory boards. So in our publishing group, we now have 20 different journals in addition to our weekly Lancet flagship journal. In mid-2018, we had 18, and overall, women represented 30% of those editorial advisory boards. But we made a commitment as a group of journals to reach parity, which we defined as 50% by 2020. And I'm really happy that by the end of January 2020, our editorial advisory boards now comprise over 50% women, with a range of 35% to 63%. And we also were committed to communicating this to our readers. When we said that we were vested in advancing the goals around gender equality, and that we were also vested in looking internally at our own practices, we committed to being accountable and transparent to readers, and we have done that. We've done that through our social media channels, and we did that in publishing 6 months after those original commitments, a long commentary that showed what commitments we were making, and announcing both a diversity pledge, which recognizes the lack of diversity traditionally in research and publishing, and our own commitments to increasing diversity and inclusion in all aspects of what we do. We also adopted a no all-male panel policy, which commits all of our editors and all the conference partnerships we do to ensure that this tradition of having all male experts on a panel no longer happens. So let me just shift gears really quickly to talk about, for a minute or two, just some preliminary concerns that have been raised from the field about this gender gap in the medical literature being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I think all of us are beginning to understand the gender-related issues of this disease and its impacts on communities of individuals both working and coping with the conditions under which we're living at the moment. Because of things like the care burdens, the disproportionate ways in which domestic responsibilities are falling on women for childcare, for homeschooling, for taking care of elders, etc. There was a concern that there would be less opportunity for women to continue their academic productivity. And the first piece of empirical research that highlighted this was a piece by Anderson and colleagues in eLife a couple of months ago. And this found that there had been I'll let you go and read the full study, but that there does appear to be the fact that during the pandemic, there was a 19% lower rate of women as first authors in papers compared to the year before. And they highlighted a particular concern around March and April, when the pandemic in many countries was at its peak, and also the lockdowns were the most restrictive in terms of working from home, etc. I want to share with you, and I do this for the first time in a presentation, some data from the Lancet. So the first is data from the Lancet that looked at published papers. This was done by an external group, Brooke Gabster and colleagues, and it was published in the Lancet last month in July of 2020. And what this reveals is actually, in contrast to that earlier paper, for us, the trends in authorship by gender have stayed fairly steady. Now, you'll see from this bar graph that our authorship trends are such that about 30% of authors are women, 70% men. So that's a very unbalanced situation among academic authors to begin with, but that has stayed steady throughout the pandemic. And in fact, if we look at the pandemic research articles for 2020, where women were the corresponding author 32.9% of the time, that's actually higher than women's authorship for all research articles last year when it was 29%. And then these are internal data which shows trends in authorship for submissions. The previous graph was for published papers. These are for submissions. And I draw out here just a single graph for our comments, which are commentaries published in the Lancet. And you will see the orange line is male, and the blue line is female. These are self-identified genders for those who have submitted to the Lancet. Has also stayed quite steady. And that peak there when we had the highest volume of submissions in March and April, that kind of gap that does exist has stayed steady. Okay, and finally, I just want to say a couple closing remarks about looking forward, because I have some things that I think the audience will be really interested in, and they sort of combine gender and COVID in ways that are really important for our discussion in this session about gender equality and the world's SDG agenda. So many of you will know that colleagues at Elsevier are doing a large-scale study of the impact of COVID lockdowns on women's authorship and reviewers. So I just wanted to point your attention to that again, in case you haven't heard about this, and you can be in touch with those who are listed on this slide. From the point of view of the Lancet, just 3 things to highlight that I think people will be very interested in. One is that we have just very recently, in the last few weeks, launched a COVID-19 Commission. And this is a large group that's going to do a review of the actions so far globally in terms of the response to the pandemic. And this is a multidisciplinary, multinational group of very experienced experts from around the world who are going to start asking tough questions about the response so far and what to learn for the next one. So we're really delighted that that has launched, and there's a piece in the Lancet to describe what the intentions of that commission are. Secondly, just hot off the press, the Lancet has announced that it is launching a Gender and Global Health Commission. I invite you to read the commentary where we describe the rationale and the importance of this particular commission. I know this will interest everyone who's presenting in this session and attending this session, and I invite you to have a look and let us know what you think. Very, very excited with outstanding co-chairs of Sarah Hawks, Pascal Alloté, and Asai El-Hadji to be working together on this wonderful commission that's going to look at gender and global health. And then finally, for about 2 years, the Lancet has been in partnership with SITE, which is the Swedish Institute for Global Health Transformation, on a commission that's looking at advancing peaceful societies through health and gender equality. So it takes up 3 of those most important SDGs, 3, 5, and 16, combining them and looking at ways that they can be leveraged to advance peace and health and gender equality. And finally, as I said, the Lancet Group is really committed to issues of gender equality. I'm very proud that we're continuing to do our part to drive change in this area. And of course, we can't have gender equality without attention to racial equality. And just in the middle of June, the Lancet wrote a very strong piece in support of Black Lives Matters and laying out our commitments to anti-racism efforts and intersectionality. And I invite you to have a look. And thank you very, very much. Hello.